Socrates never wrote a line of his own. He spoke in courtyards, in streets, and yet his voice travels farther than ink. People think they know him, the father of philosophy, the gadfly of Athens, a lifelong challenger who toppled comforts with a single question. But myths love certainty, and Socrates is a magnet for certainty. The moment we pin him down, we begin to miss what makes him both elusive and bright. We begin with the first myth that still travels from marble halls to cafe tables: that Socrates invented the scientific method. The claim sounds tidy, almost seductive, as if a single man created a blueprint for thinking that would outlive empires. Yet the truth, humbler and more stubborn: Socrates didn't codify a system. He did something rarer. He made thinking itself into a practice you could perform with another person. He walked the agora not to lecture, but to test, to sift through beliefs with patient, stubborn questions. He didn't publish treatises. He published dialogues of doubt. The method is not a set of steps, but a pace: question, counterexample, refine, question again. That nuance often slips away, leaving behind a silhouette of certainty where there is only doubt in motion. The second myth is the one that recurs like a rumor in lecture halls. Socrates left behind a single, cohesive system. Some imagine a complete philosophy, neatly labeled and hung on a wall. In truth, his thoughts resemble a living river, splitting into different streams as the seasons change. In Plato's dialogues, you hear Socrates who pushes, prods, and sometimes unsettles his friends by adopting new stances in different scenes. In Xenophon, you glimpse a more practical, even polite conversationalist, steering conversations toward virtue and civic life. The result is not a fixed doctrine, but a pattern of inquiry that morphs with the questions asked. If you seek a diagram of Socratic certainty, you will be frustrated. If you seek the courage to question your own certainty, you might begin to understand him. But the third myth deserves the most airtime, because it is the most seductive. Socrates as an anti-democratic rebel who toppled Athenian democracy and carved a personal path of disobedience. The charge at his trail was impiety and corrupting the youth. It's easy to read that as political rebellion. A man burning down the city's sacred trees with relentless inquiry. Yet the evidence points to something subtler. He moved within the city, he critiqued, spoke to young Athenians, and made the common life a stage for moral testing. He did not escape the city's rules. He exposed the fragility of those rules when they meet a life that insists on asking why. His execution, an act performed by a democracy that trembled at losing face, remains a paradox. The city punished a man for challenging it, and in so doing, it bore witness to the power of a life committed to asking rather. As we navigate these myths, a clearer image begins to emerge. Socrates did not present a ready-made system to be adopted. He offered a practice of living questions. He treated wisdom not as a possession, but as a horizon, something to move toward with each disputation, with each pause where the listener recognizes the limits of what they thought they knew. The unexpected gift of his approach is the fountain of humility it births in those who study him. If you think you know the truth, he would gently lift the rug and show you that the floor is still shifting beneath your feet. Consider the daily life of ordinary people: parents, neighbors, colleagues who say they're sure about what they believe, and then discover that certainty is a kind of heat that can burn away empathy if not tempered by doubt. Socrates invites a form of courage that is not bravado, but vulnerability. The courage to stand with another person while saying, "Let us examine this together." The power of that invitation is not in victory over an opponent, but in shared growth. A collective willingness to revise, to admit we were mistaken, to keep going. This is not nostalgia for a golden age. It is a reminder that the most dangerous myths are the ones that the stories we tell ourselves to avoid the messiness of real thinking. The myths about Socrates are not antiquarian curiosities. They echo in our classrooms, in our debates, in the way we treat dissent. When we mistake the man for a complete system, we miss the method that still matters. The practice of questioning with care, the insistence that a good life is a life of examined choices. The recognition that wisdom grows where doubt is allowed to speak. If the myths fall away, what remains is a modest but stubborn claim that philosophy begins in dialogue, in the patient work of listening and asking, in the humility to change one's mind. Socrates doesn't offer a final answer so much as a persistent invitation to keep seeking, to keep refining, to resist the easy answers that feel comforting but hollow. His life becomes a mirror for our own. The more we tilt towards certainty, the more we risk losing the very thing that makes us human, a readiness to grow. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a paradox that feels almost ancient and utterly contemporary. Knowledge isn't a possession, but a practice. The myths about Socrates are not simply mistaken facts. They are tests of our own readiness to engage with doubt. Will we treat doubt as a danger to be avoided, or as a doorway to clarity? Will we mistake ritual certainty for truth? Or will we press further into the hard work of definition, evidence, and fair hearing? Socrates would likely answer with a quiet challenge. Begin where you stand, ask the next honest question, and let the conversation teach you who you are becoming. In the end, the three myths are less about the man and more about our own hunger for certainty. The real Socrates does not demand faith in a rigid doctrine. He demands attention to the living questions that determine how we live together. This is the strange gift of his life. A reminder that wisdom is not a possession, but a practice. Something we practice for a lifetime, without ever feeling we have fully mastered it. And perhaps that is the truest tribute we can offer to a thinker who spent his life teaching us to. Think more carefully about what we think we know. As you walk away from this, carry one small turning point with you, that a question well asked is already a kind of answer, and a life continually tested by questions is a life worth living. Let that turning point be your compass through the coming weeks. If we treat Socrates as a museum piece, we miss the living question in his methods. If we treat him as a system founder, we forget the restless hunger that drove him to ask again after every answer. The truth is more intimate. His questions are a practice you can carry into ordinary days. Think for a moment about the first myth, the idea that the method itself was a prepackaged algorithm. In reality, the strength lay in a shared commitment to moving together toward clarity. It was never about getting the right answer in a single moment, but about staying with a question long enough to let it rearrange the furniture in your mind. That patience is a muscle we seldom exercise in a world of instant verdicts. When you feel that pressure to decide now, breathe and invite the other person into the next step of inquiry rather than the final destination. The second myth, that Socrates left behind a fixed doctrine, invites a similar correction. His conversations resemble a garden that changes with the seasons, a flux of angles and positions, not a rigid scaffold. In Plato, you meet a Socrates who toys with rival positions. In Xenophon, you meet a more practical mentor. Both are valuable threads of one larger practice: to question with care, to listen with intent, to refine a stance without swallowing certainty whole. The danger of a fixed system is that it becomes a shield against new questions. The virtue of a living practice is its adaptability, its willingness to revise in the face of new evidence or new lived experience. And the third myth, the charge of anti-democratic rebellion, deserves the most nuance because it cuts to the heart of how we judge dissent today. Socrates did not abandon Athens. He pressed it to examine itself. He turned the city's own expectations against them, not to destroy but to provoke growth. The paradox is stark. A democracy punished a man for challenging it. And in that collision, we glimpse a larger truth about democracy itself: the health of a polis rests on its willingness to tolerate voices that unsettle the familiar. From this vantage, The myths flip from being portraits of a man to mirrors for us. Socrates becomes a call to a daily discipline, to test our beliefs with respect for others, to let doubt have a seat at the table, and to understand that wisdom is a horizon always receding as we approach it. The shift is quiet, almost inconvenient. It asks us to keep showing up to conversations we fear, to stay with ambiguity, to measure our certainty not by its loudness, but by its openness to revision. So how do we bring this into our own lives? Start small. In your next conversation, name the claim clearly. Then ask a single clarifying question. What would count as evidence for or against this? Pause for a breath before you answer. And listen as if the other person's point might actually shift your own. Read a dialogue, not as a relic, but as a map showing how questions evolve with context. And if you ever feel the urge to prove Socrates right, remember, the aim was never persuasion, but illumination, a shared step toward a wiser, more humane version of ourselves. If you live by this practice, the myths cease to be obstacles and become invitations. They invite you to reframe certainty as responsibility, to treat disagreement as a doorway, and to recognize that the deepest conversations rarely end with a verdict, but with a widened sense of what is possible to know together. The living Socrates, through this lens, remains not a distant icon, but a companion in the grind and grace of everyday thinking. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring tribute we can offer to a thinker who spent his life teaching us to think more.